Welcome. I promise no more than 400 slides, no more than that. So I'm going to try and set the scene for you a little. At the top level, if you take the streaming media business, the big players in it, it looks pretty healthy. $100 billion will be recorded in revenue this year, but it's not divided all that equally. You can see how much of that Netflix grabs. Almost as much revenue as the other four biggest players here combined. But even Netflix is smaller than YouTube. So put that in perspective, YouTube will make 37% more revenue than Netflix this year. When we come to the smaller players and the European players, well, the biggest amongst those is DAZN, the sports streamer. But if you look at the scale, it's an order of magnitude less than those big players. And it gets pretty small when you get down the real speciality end of the chart there. Now, revenue is one thing, profit, of course, is another thing, and the path to profitability is a hard path. You can see on this chart instantly a lot of red. It's been a slow, painful progression to start turning that red into something positive. From a profit perspective, it's easy to see that two big winners of the streaming wars, Netflix and YouTube. Their profit is massively more. But of course, they come from very different places. In terms of content, YouTube has famously been driven by what has now been called the creator economy. New stars creating new kinds of content. Who knows the Sidemen? Yep. A massive hit on YouTube, but then Netflix comes along, sees this talent and says, we want a bit of that to put behind our paywall. Will it work on a subscription platform? Well, actually, looking at the UK data, clearly it does. So the second season of Sidemen's biggest show, Sidemen Inside, has actually got more audience on Netflix than on YouTube. So creator economy content can work behind the paywall. But at the global level, the battle's now on to retain subscribers in a very saturated and competitive market. At the global level, you can see how far ahead Netflix is in subscriber terms. But of course, what everyone cares about in the subscriber world is churn. Not just keeping subscribers, but retaining them. This is churn data for the US, and you can see even Netflix has been struggling to retain subscribers. But even so, of course, it retains a commanding lead over the other players in the US market. In the UK, the churn rates, you can see here, Netflix way along the bottom. On a chart like this showing churn, you want to be at the bottom, not at the top, right? So as a result, that translates into a commanding market lead in the UK, Netflix way ahead of all those other players. So in today's market, the push towards profitability means that you need to pivot. And there are two major pivots that I'm just going to briefly touch on. The pivot from subscription to broadening business models, so adding advertising, so-called hybrid business models, And the second pivot is to move into the sports market, which is a really important place. So, subscription to advertising, 25% of Netflix subs now are on an ad tier in the 12 markets they've launched in. Of course, that is massively less than Amazon, that simply flipped the advertising switch and everyone got advertising unless they opted out. 88% kept the advertising because they didn't want to pay more. The result for most of the premium streamers, those big players I showed you to start with, their ad tier has actually grown the overall subscriber base. So it's done what they wanted. There are more overall customers, and it hasn't really cannibalized the premium part of the business. Interestingly, Netflix is the only service where when they added the ad tier, they actually started cannibalizing the premium part. So 40% traded down to a cheaper price. However, Netflix actually makes more money per user from those that take the ad tier. So that mix, that hybrid mix of subscription and advertising generates more money per viewer for Netflix, unlike the others. So that's something really important to bear in mind. What's the impact of adding advertising to actually retaining your customers? Well, turns out for Netflix, not a lot. If you look at those numbers, going from premium down to the ad tier, marginal impact in terms of the retention. A much bigger impact actually for Disney Plus. So interestingly, they are losing out more from taking that ad tier approach. Pivot 2, the one to move to add sports to your element, and Netflix of course has done this in a pretty significant way. Notably, arguably, is it sport or not sport, but the Paul Tyson boxing match, definitely sport, adding NFL matches on Christmas Day. Why do it? This chart shows why you do it. This is the daily signups. Look at the impact of those two sports events on Netflix signups in the US. Massive impact. And if you look at the UK numbers, where that match was at some stupid hour to watch, right? Still a massive impact. And if you look at the biggest ever show that Netflix has had, Squid Game, actually the Paul Tyson fight generated more new subscriptions for Netflix than even Squid Game. This is the first title that people watched when they came into the service. That is how important sports can be. That's why people pay so much for those rights. But it's one thing generating new subs from big events, it's quite another keeping them, right? Retaining them. However, you can see actually that the retention rate is not bad at all. So 8 months later in the US, 50% of those who signed up to watch that boxing match were still there. That is pretty impressive, and a similar level of retention for the NFL. So it pays off to acquire those subs, and it pays off to keep them. But what happens if you try and go all sport? So if sport is your primary content category, not just a nice add-on to what you do, if you are the likes of, in the US, DAZN and Fubo, you get churn rates that look like this. This is a typical churn rate for a sports-only streaming service where people are coming in and out, because that's the nature of the sports events business. Netflix, again, nicely flat along the bottom in churn rate. The sports really rapidly fluctuating. Same thing in the UK, even wilder in terms of those churn rate fluctuations, right? Where here I've taken the DAZN service and Now, which is Sky's streaming service in the UK. So if you make sports your cornerstone, you get a lot of churn. So to sum up my thoughts, advertising and sports as a pivot can be key tools to improve profitability, but only as part of an overall smarter and more flexible strategy to gain and retain new subscribers. And that, I think, is what you're going to hear about now from the rest of our illustrious speaker teams. Thank you very much.
Carlos, on the Netflix side, they have Tyson, but that Tyson match is not, they're going to do Carmelo this weekend. They pick the matches that they know are going to not be a broad appeal. Correct? And so their success in sports is not necessarily you're a sports fan, you're more of an entertainment fan. Would that be the correct analogy?
I think that's an accurate observation. They're especially going for events where they can get a global appeal. So, NFL now is sort of getting there as a global property as well, but things like the Tyson Full fight have that global appeal. They quite like Apple. Apple is also going for global sports rights deals. So they did the deal for women's soccer in the US and took global rights. The Major League Soccer in the US took global rights to it. Of course, fronted by arguably the best footballer that has ever played the game, who they incentivized to have a percent of every subscription sold to Apple TV Plus. So that was a good deal both ways. But yeah, you're right. Pick events that have global entertainment appeal.